Before the first sail broke the horizon, before the iron blade met the skin of the earth, there was a silence that held the weight of 1,000 years. They call it history now, but to those who lived it, it was a dream that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. A world of emerald empires, blood-soaked altars, and a shadow that began to crawl across the sun. This is the story of the end of the beginning. The heat in the Mississippi Valley didn't just sit, it breathed. It was A.D. 1250. In the heart of the great city, Cahokia, 10,000 souls moved like ants beneath the shadow of Monk's Mound. The city was a sprawling marvel of thatched roofs, bustling plazas, and towering earthen pyramids that defied the very gravity of the marshlands. Kalen stood at the edge of the ground plaza, his skin stained with the red ochre of the Sun Clan. He wasn't looking at the traders or the smoke from the temple fires. He was looking at the birds. Thousands of them, blackbirds and crows, were flying south, not in a formation, but in a panic. "The earth is holding its breath," a voice rasped behind him. It was Elder Ohanzi, a man whose face was a map of scars and wisdom. He pointed a withered finger toward the northern horizon. The sky there wasn't blue or gray, it was a bruised, sickly purple. "The great sun, the king, thinks his gold and his sacrifices keep the world spinning," Ohanzi whispered, his voice trembling. "But the spirits have stopped listening. For 3 moons the prophets have seen the same thing, a great silence, a silence that eats words, a silence that eats people." Kalen felt a chill despite the sweltering sun. He was a runner, trained to carry messages across the vast trade networks that stretched from the copper mountains of the north to the obsidian coasts of the south. He knew the trails better than any man alive. "What do you want me to do?" Kalen asked, his hand tightening around his flint knife. "The dream is breaking, Kalen," the elder said, looking him in the eye. "You must run, not to the next village, but to the Forbidden Ridge. Someone or something is whispering a new language there, and if that word is spoken before we are ready, our world will vanish as if it were never here." As the sun began to dip, a low, rhythmic thumping started from the great temple. It wasn't a drum, it was the sound of thousands of people hitting the ground in unison. The sacrifice was beginning, but for the first time in a century, the sun didn't turn golden at the sight of blood. It turned a dark, terrifying crimson. The descent from the great city was like leaving the world of the living. As Kalen crossed the river, the constant roar of Cahokia's 10,000 voices faded into a haunting, heavy stillness. Behind him lay the pyramids of earth and the smoke of civilization. Before him lay the blackwood, a forest so dense the sun struggled to touch the forest floor. Kalen's legs moved with the precision of a predator. As a runner, his lungs were his greatest weapon, but today they felt tight. The air here tasted like old copper and damp rot. The encounter. 2 days into the journey, the trail vanished. The ancient markers, carved stones and notched trees, had been defaced. Great chunks of bark had been ripped away, not by the claws of a bear, but by something that used tools. Kalen knelt, pressing his palm to a footprint in the mud. It was human in shape, but the stride was impossibly long, and the weight behind the step had crushed the limestone beneath. "You are a long way from your king's shadow, runner." Kalen spun, his flint blade flashing in the dim light. Standing on a fallen cedar was a woman clad in deer hide and bone charms. Her eyes were painted with charcoal, making them look like 2 endless pits. This was Naya, a nomadic scout from the fringe tribes, people the great sun called savages. "The elder sent me," Kalen said, his breath coming in sharp bursts. "The sky is turning, the birds are fleeing." Naya didn't move. She sniffed the air, her face twisting in disgust. "The sky is the least of your worries. Look at the trees, city boy." Kalen looked. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed the gray moss hanging from the branches. It wasn't blowing in the wind. It was reaching downward, twitching toward them as if it could sense the heat of their blood. "The silence has a hunger," Naya whispered. "It started at the forbidden ridge. It's a rot that doesn't eat the body, it eats the memory. Villages just disappear, not burned, not raided, just empty. Clothes left on the ground, food left on the fire. But the people, it's as if they were never born." The night of the whispers. As darkness fell, they didn't dare light a fire. A fire was a beacon for things that hunted by light. They climbed into the high canopy of an ancient oak, tethering themselves to the trunk with leather cords. In the middle of the night, the forest began to speak. It wasn't the wind, it was 1,000 voices, overlapping in a language Kaelin had never heard. It sounded like the clicking of insects with the sobbing of a child. "The dream is ending. The word is coming." Kaelin covered his ears, but the sound was inside his skull. He looked down and saw them, shadowy figures moving through the underbrush. They were pale, their skin reflecting the moonlight like fish scales. They moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, their heads tilted at impossible angles. One of the creatures stopped directly beneath their tree. It looked up. It had no eyes, only smooth, unbroken skin where a face should be. Yet it peered straight at Kaelin. It opened its mouth, and instead of a scream, it emitted a perfect, terrifying mimicry of Kaelin's own voice. "Run, Kaelin, run to the ridge. We are waiting to speak your name." The choice. By dawn, the creatures were gone, leaving only a trail of black, oily sludge on the leaves. Kaelin's hands were shaking. He had been raised to believe the great sun was the center of the universe, but here, in the raw throat of the wilderness, his gods felt small and distant. "They are heading for the ridge," Naya said, sharpening a spear tipped with a jagged tooth. "If we go forward, we aren't just messengers anymore. We are prey." Kaelin looked back toward the direction of the great city. He could almost imagine the pyramids crumbling into dust, forgotten by time. "If the dream ends," Kaelin said, his voice now cold and determined, "I want to be awake to see what comes next." They began to climb. The forbidden ridge loomed ahead, a jagged spine of rock that tore through the clouds, glowing with a faint, sickly green light that promised either salvation or a total, unspoken end.
Every step felt like pulling a foot out of deep tar. The silence Ohanzi had warned about wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a physical weight. It pressed against Kaelin's eardrums until they throbbed. Beside him, Naya was pale, her bone charms rattling not from the wind, but from her own shivering. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her voice sounding tiny, as if the forest was swallowing her words before they could travel a foot. "The ground," Kaelin replied. "It's humming." They reached the summit of the ridge at dusk. Below them lay a hidden basin that wasn't on any map Kaelin had ever studied in the great city. In the center of the basin sat a structure that defied the logic of the mound builders. It wasn't made of earth or timber. It was a jagged spire of black glass, obsidian, polished to a mirror sheen, rising 300 feet into the air. Around the base of the spire, thousands of the pale ones, the eyeless creatures from the woods, stood in perfect, motionless circles. They weren't fighting. They weren't eating. They were waiting. The vision in the glass. "We have to get closer," Kaelin said, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "That is a death sentence," Naya hissed, grabbing his arm. "Look at them. They aren't breathing. They've given themselves to whatever is in that stone." But Kaelin felt a pull. It wasn't magic. It was a tether. He felt as if a hook had been placed in his chest, reeling him toward the black glass. He broke away from Naya and descended into the basin, moving like a ghost between the frozen ranks of the pale ones. They didn't even flinch as he passed. Their skin felt cold, like wet clay. He reached the spire. He pressed his palm against the obsidian. The world vanished. Suddenly, Kalen wasn't on the ridge. He was standing in the grand plaza of Cahokia, but it was 500 years in the future. The Great Pyramids were gone, covered in grass and dirt, looking like nothing more than natural hills. The people were gone. The language he spoke, the language of the Sun Clan, was a dead echo. He saw tall ships with white wings approaching the coast. He saw men in suits of iron carrying sticks that spat fire. He saw the great dream of his people being erased, not by war, but by forgetting. Then a voice spoke. It didn't come from the air. It came from his own blood. The dream is only a dream as long as it is unspoken. Once the word is uttered, the end begins. You are the keeper of the silence, Kalen. If you speak the name of the shadow, you invite it into the world. The betrayal of light. Kalen gasped, his soul slamming back into his body. He fell away from the spire, gasping for air. Kalen, move! Naya's scream shattered the silence. He looked up. The pale ones were no longer still. Their heads had snapped toward him in unison. A low vibration started in their throats, a hum that vibrated the very stones beneath his feet. From the top of the black spire, a beam of sickly green light shot straight into the bruised clouds. The sky tore open. Something was descending, not a god, not a demon, but a shape that shifted between smoke and solid shadow. "The word!" the creature shrieked, in Kalen's own voice. "Speak the word! Give us the name!" Kalen realized with a jolt of horror that the silence wasn't a curse, it was a shield. As long as the people of the valley didn't know the name of this ancient horror, it had no power over them. But the elder had sent him here to find answers. By seeking the truth, Kalen had led the hunger straight to the pantry. "We have to burn it," Naya shouted, sliding down the embankment with a torch made of resin and dried cedar. "If we can't stop the word, we burn the mouth that speaks it." But as she stepped toward the spire, the shadows lunged. One of the pale ones moved with blinding speed, its elongated fingers wrapping around Naya's throat. It didn't squeeze, it did something worse. It put its mouth against hers and began to inhale. Kalen watched in terror as Naya's eyes turned dull and gray. Her memories, her spirit, her very dream was being sucked out of her. "No!" Kalen roared. He drew his flint knife, but the blade shattered against the skin of the creature. The shadow from the sky was now hovering just yards above him, a cold so intense it turned his sweat to ice. It had no face, yet Kalen felt 1,000 gazes boring into his soul, leafing through his memories like a wind through dead leaves. It saw his childhood in the maize fields. It saw the first time he ran the long trail. It saw the face of the great Sun King. "Your world is a flicker, runner," the voices hissed, vibrating through his teeth. "Give us the name, and the flickering stops. No more hunger, no more fear, only the great silence." The internal war. Kalen felt his tongue begin to move against his will. His mind was being invaded by a word, a jagged, multisyllabic sound that tasted like ash and ancient metal. It was a name that hadn't been spoken since the stars were young, a name that acted as a key to the lock of the physical world. If he spoke it, the spire would become a gateway. The pale ones would no longer be mindless shadows, they would become flesh. The Mississippi would run black, and the great city of Cahokia would become a tomb of glass. "I will not," Kalen wheezed. He reached into his medicine pouch. His fingers brushed against a small, jagged piece of flint, not a weapon, but a gift from Elder Ohanzi. It was wrapped in a scrap of bison hide, inscribed with a single symbol, the root. In the mythology of his people, the root was what held the Sky Father and the Earth Mother together. It represented the unspoken dream, the potential of everything that could be, provided it stayed hidden. Kalen didn't try to stab the shadow. He knew steel and stone couldn't hurt a thought. Instead, he drove the sharp flint into his own palm and pressed the bleeding wound against the obsidian spire. The blood sacrifice. The reaction was violent. The obsidian didn't just shatter, it screamed. The blood of a living, dreaming man was poisoned to the cold, static void of the silence. Where the red met the black, cracks spiderwebbed across the 300-foot structure. The green light flickering at the top turned a chaotic, burning orange. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering like a dying candle. "You would destroy the dream to save the silence?" it shrieked. "I would die to keep you nameless," Kalen shouted. The ground beneath the basin began to heave.
The pale ones began to dissolve, their bodies turning into fine white sand that was swept away by a sudden freezing wind. The spire groaned, leaning dangerously toward the center of the valley. The escape. Kaylin scrambled toward Naya. She was breathing, but her eyes were wide and vacant. She didn't recognize him. She didn't recognize the sky. "Naya, look at me!" He grabbed her, throwing her arm over his shoulder. The ridge was collapsing. The silence was breaking, but it was taking the physical world with it. Boulders the size of houses tumbled from the peaks, and the black glass spire exploded into 1,000,000,000 lethal shards. Kaylin ran. He didn't run like a messenger. He ran like a man escaping the end of time. Behind him, the green light imploded, sucking the air, the trees, and the very shadows into a single pinpoint vacuum. When the shockwave hit, it threw them 100 yards into the brush. The aftermath. Kaylin woke up to the sound of birds. Real birds. The frantic, panicked flight was over. The sky was no longer bruised. It was a pale, hesitant gray of a new dawn. But when he looked back toward the forbidden ridge, it was gone. Not leveled, but gone, as if someone had cut a hole out of the horizon. He looked at Naya. She was sitting up, staring at her hands. "Who are you?" she asked softly. Her voice was musical, but the edge, the fire he had known, was extinguished. Kaylin felt a tear track through the dirt on his face. He had saved the world from the name, but the cost was the memory of the person who had helped him do it. "I'm a runner," Kaylin said, his voice cracking. "And we have to go back. The great city needs to know. The silence is gone, but the hunger is just sleeping." As they began the long walk back to Cahokia, Kaylin looked at his scarred palm. The wound had healed into the shape of a word he could never say, but would never forget. The dream was no longer unspoken. It was written in his very blood.
The air changed as they approached the outskirts of Cahokia. It didn't smell of wood smoke and roasting maize anymore. It smelled of stagnation and copper. Kaylin stood on the final ridge overlooking the valley. The sight broke his heart. The great city, the jewel of the Mississippi, was hemorrhaging. The vibrant painted walls of the elite villas were peeling. The grand plaza, once a sea of colorful traders and feathered warriors, was now a chaotic swarm of refugees. Thousands were fleeing. They carried their lives on their backs, woven baskets, clay pots, and frightened children. They were running from a city that hadn't been attacked by an army, but by a sickness of the mind. The Gate of Skulls. As they reached the city gates, they were met not by welcoming heralds, but by the Jaguar Guard, the Sun King's elite enforcers. Their obsidian-studded clubs were stained with fresh blood. They weren't guarding against an enemy. They were keeping the starving citizens from leaving. "Halt, runner!" a commander barked, his face hidden behind a snarling wooden mask. "The great sun has decreed that no soul shall depart until the gods are appeased. Where is your tribute? Where is the message from the north?" Kaylin stepped forward, shielding Naya. He raised his scarred palm, the wound from the spire now a raised, pulsing welt of silver-gray tissue. "I bring a message for the elder, and for the king. The north is gone. The ridge has fallen into the void." The guards hesitated. They saw the look in Kaylin's eyes, the look of a man who had stared into the throat of the universe and survived. They stepped aside, whispering prayers to the Earth Mother. The ascent of Monk's Mound. Kaylin led Naya up the massive earthen stairs of Monk's Mound. The climb was grueling. At the summit, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of burning copal and something metallic. There, sitting on a throne of cedar and pearls, was the great Sun King. He was a man transformed by terror. His golden headcrest was crooked, and his eyes were bloodshot from sleeplessness. Beside him stood Elder Ohanzi, looking older than the earth itself. "You return," the king hissed, his voice a dry rattle. "The prophets say the sun is dying. They say the silence is a mouth, and it is closing around us. Give me the word, runner. Give me the name of the god that demands this darkness, so I may bargain with it." "There is no bargain, my lord," Kaylin said, his voice echoing across the temple floor. "The thing at the ridge was not a god. It was a mirror. It feeds on our stories, our names, our very breath. If you speak its name, you give it the keys to your house." The king stood up, his jewelry clattering.
I am the sun. I bargain with the heavens. If blood is what it wants, I will give it the blood of every man in this valley, but I will not rule over a kingdom of dust. The betrayal of the wise. Kaelin looked at Ohanzi, seeking help, but the elder's face was a mask of cold desperation. Kaelin, Ohanzi said softly, stepping toward him. The people are losing their minds. They forget their mother's names. They forget how to plant the corn. If we do not give them an enemy to name, a shape to hate, the city will tear itself apart before the moon rises. Give the king the name. Let us craft a ritual to bind it. You don't understand. Kaelin backed away, pulling Naya with him. To name it is to invite it. The silence is a shield. As long as we don't speak it, the shadow remains a dream. If we speak it, the dream becomes our reality. The king signaled his guards. Seize him. If he will not speak the name with his tongue, we will carve it out of his heart. The priests say the blood of a traveler holds the ink of the stars. We will read the name in his veins. The breaking of the world. The jaguar guards lunged. Kaelin moved with the fluid speed of a man who had run across 1,000 miles of wilderness. He ducked a swinging club and kicked a torch into the heavy hem curtains of the temple. Flame erupted instantly. In the confusion, Naya did something unexpected. Though her mind was gone, her body remembered the hunt. She let out a piercing bird-like shriek, the same sound the Pale Ones had made, and tackled the high priest. Run, Kaelin shouted, grabbing her hand. They didn't run down the stairs. They ran toward the back of the mound, where the ceremonial cliff dropped sheer into the river below. Behind them, the king was screaming commands, his voice cracking with madness. The temple was a pyre, the black smoke rising to meet the bruised sky. Kaelin looked in Taya. For a fleeting second, a spark of the old girl returned to her eyes. She smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and squeezed his hand. Before the dream was spoken, she whispered. It was the first thing she had said in days. Then they leapt. As they fell toward the dark, rushing waters of the Mississippi, the sky above Cahokia finally broke. A thunderclap, louder than the collapse of a mountain, shook the world. The great spire's energy, which Kaelin had tried to contain, finally reached the city. The silence didn't come with a roar. It came with a sigh. Beneath the water, Kaelin felt the vibration of the world changing. When he surfaced, gasping for air and clinging to a piece of driftwood, he looked back. The great city was still there, but the fires were gone. The screaming had stopped. A thick white mist was rolling over the mounds, erasing the silhouettes of the pyramids. The dream had been spoken, and the world would never remember it was there. When Kaelin finally dragged his body onto a muddy sandbar miles downstream, the world felt fundamentally altered. The air was no longer thick with the vibration of 10,000 lives. It was hollow. He coughed up river water, his lungs burning, and crawled toward the limp form of Naya. She was alive, but as he turned her over, he saw the silver-gray mark from his own palm had transferred to her cheek. The word was spreading like a brand. Naya, he croaked. She looked at him, and for the first time there was no fear. There was nothing. The birds, she whispered, pointing at the sky. They've forgotten how to fly. Kaelin looked. In the dim pre-dawn light, dozens of herons and hawks were falling from the sky, their wings folded, dropping into the river like stones. They hadn't died midair. They had simply lost the instinct of what a wing was for. The ghost of the road. As they began to walk, not toward the city, but away from it, they encountered the first hollow. It was a trader Kaelin recognized from the northern routes. The man was sitting in the middle of the trail, surrounded by bags of precious copper and iridescent shells. He wasn't guarding them. He was staring at a piece of flint in his hand as if he had never seen a stone before. Brother, Kaelin said, reaching out. The trader looked up. His eyes were the color of milk. He trailed off, his brow furrowed in a painful, futile effort to remember his own name. Then he simply stood up and walked into the river, sinking beneath the surface without a struggle. He hadn't chosen death. He had simply forgotten how to live. A name, Kaelin realized, his heart turning to lead. The king spoke it. He thought he was bargaining, but he gave the silence a mouth. The Obsidian Hunter. They weren't alone in the woods. A sound like breaking glass echoed through the timber. Kalen pulled Naya behind a massive cypress root. From the mist emerged a figure that made the pale ones look like children. It was a stalker of the void, a creature 7 feet tall, its body composed entirely of jagged obsidian shards held together by a floor of green flickering light. It wasn't hunting for meat, it was hunting for stories. The creature stopped near the spot where the trader had vanished. It leaned down, sniffing the air. Where the trader's footprints were, the stalker touched the ground, and the footprints vanished, erased from the timeline as if the man had never walked there. The stalker turned its head toward the cypress root. It didn't have a face, just a vertical slit that pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat. "It can smell your memory, Kalen," a voice hissed. Kalen spun around. Ducked into a hollow log was a young boy, no older than 10, his skin painted in the forbidden blue of the river exiles. He held a small pouch of salt in his trembling hands. "If you think of your home, it will find you," the boy whispered. "Think of nothing. Think of the rain. Think of the mud. If you hold a memory too tight, it glows like a fire in the dark to them." The last sanctuary. The boy, whose name was Mato, led them through a path that defied logic, walking backwards, stepping only on stones, and rubbing their skin with bitter herbs to mask the scent of life. He led them to a hidden cave behind a waterfall where a dozen survivors huddled. They weren't warriors or kings. They were the unimportant, the ones the great Sun King had ignored. "The city is gone," Mato told them, his voice unnervingly calm for a child. "Not knocked down, just unmade. People are walking into the woods and becoming trees. Trees are turning into smoke. The dream is being folded back into the earth." Kalen looked at the survivors. They were all holding onto objects, a doll, a cracked pod, a braid of hair. "We are the keepers," an old woman said from the back of the cave. "We hold the pieces of what used to be, but the stalkers are coming for the pieces. They want the world to be a blank slate again." I looked at my scarred palm. It was glowing brighter now, the silver gray light pulsing in time with the stalker outside. I wasn't a runner anymore. I was a beacon. "I brought them here," Kalen said, his voice cold with realization. "As long as I remember the name, they will follow me. I am the map they are using to find the rest of you." He looked at Naya, who was braiding a piece of grass, her mind lost in a peaceful, empty void, and he realized there was only one way to stop the stalkers. He had to do the one thing a runner is never supposed to do. He had to lose the message. The ritual of the void. "Mato," Kalen said, handing the boy his flint knife. "There is a place further south, a place where the sun still speaks to the stone. Take her there. Take them all." "What about you?" the boy asked.
The silence had not been defeated. It had simply been fed. By sacrificing his identity to shatter the stalker, Kalen had inadvertently turned himself into a living bridge. He was no longer a man, but he wasn't yet a shadow. He was the threshold. Mato and the survivors watched from the mouth of the cave. They saw Kalen standing in the center of a swirling vortex of white sand and black glass. His skin was glowing with a terrifying, rhythmic light, pulses of silver that matched the heartbeat of the earth itself. "He's becoming the Word," the old woman whispered, clutching her bone charms. "He's the only thing keeping the sky from folding in on us." The migration of the hollowed. Naya stepped out from the shadows of the waterfall. Her eyes, once vacant, were now fixed on Kalen. She didn't know his name, but she felt the pull of the gravity he was creating. She walked toward him, her feet sinking into the mud. "Stop!" Mato cried out, reaching for her. "The light will eat you." Naya didn't stop. She reached the circle of shimmering dust and stepped inside. The wind whipped her hair into a frenzy, and the silver light bled into her skin. She reached out and took Kalen's hand. The moment their skin touched, a shock wave rippled through the valley. The white mist that had been erasing the world suddenly stopped its advance. It didn't retreat, but it solidified, turning into a wall of impenetrable frost that marked the new boundary of the world. Inside the circle, Kalen's eyes snapped open. They weren't milky white anymore. They were gold, the color of the sun before the shadow had touched it. "I remember," he gasped, his voice sounding like 1,000 people speaking at once. "I remember. The end. The vision of the new world. Kalen wasn't seeing the river anymore. He was seeing the future. He saw the centuries pass in a heartbeat. He saw the mounds of Cahokia grow over with oak and vine, becoming nothing more than hills that children would play on without knowing they stood on the graves of an empire. He saw the Iron Men arrive from the sea, bringing their own words, their own names, and their own hungers. He realized that the silence was a cycle. Every few thousand years, the world grew too full of stories, too heavy with its own history, and the great forgetting arrived to reset the balance. "We are the seeds," Kalen whispered to Naya. "We are the things that are meant to be forgotten so that something else can grow." Naya nodded, a single tear carving a path through the silver light on her face. The dream must be hidden. The last command. Kalen turned his gaze toward Motto and the survivors. The power radiating from him was cracking the stones beneath his feet. He was becoming too heavy for the physical world to hold. "Go south," Kalen's voice boomed, vibrating in their very marrow. "Beyond the great delta, where the salt water meets the sky, there is a place where the silence cannot reach, a place where the old stories are written in the stone, not in the breath. You must take the pieces there. You must wait." "Wait for what?" Motto shouted over the roar of the collapsing reality. "Wait for the one who will speak the next dream." With a final violent surge of energy, Kalen pushed the survivors away. A wall of golden light erupted between the cave and the riverbank, acting as a shield. The transformation. Kalen and Naya were alone now, trapped within the vortex. The obsidian shards of the fallen stalker began to rise, swirling around them, knitting together. But they weren't forming a monster, they were forming a monument. As the light reached its breaking point, Kalen felt the last of his human self slip away. He forgot the feel of the wind. He forgot the pain in his legs. He became a pillar of pure, unyielding memory. The light imploded. When the dust settled and the sun finally rose over a world that was quieter, emptier, and stranger than it had been the day before, the riverbank was vacant. There was no Kalen. There was no Naya. In their place stood two twin pillars of black glass, fused at the base. They were smooth as water and deep as the night sky. If a traveler were to press an ear against the glass, they wouldn't hear the wind. They would hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a heartbeat and the whispered names of 10,000 people who had never existed in the history books. Epilogue. The first word. Hundreds of miles to the south, Motto and the survivors emerged from the tree line. They looked out over a vast blue expanse of ocean they had only heard of in legends. Motto looked at the small flint knife Kalen had given him. He knelt in the sand, and for the first time in the history of the New World, he picked up a stick. He didn't speak. He didn't scream. He drew a single circle in the sand, a seed. The silence had won the battle, erasing the empire of the mounds. But as the tide came in to wash the circle away, Motto simply drew it again. The dream wasn't dead. It was just waiting for a new language. The world did not end with a scream. It ended with a sigh of relief. In the wake of the implosion at the riverbank, a great amnesia settled over the Mississippi Valley. The survivors who fled south with Motto felt their memories of Cahokia thinning like smoke in a gale. By the time they reached the shimmering white sands of the Gulf, they no longer remembered the names of their kings or the geometry of their temples. They only knew one thing: they had to keep moving. The 1,000-year sleep. Centuries bled into each other. The great city of Cahokia was reclaimed by the earth. Oak trees pierced through the thatch of fallen villas, and the rains smoothed the sharp edges of the earthen pyramids until they looked nothing more than the natural rolling hills of the Illinois plains. The silence had won. To the world that followed, the empire of the mounds was a ghost, a civilization that had vanished without leaving a single written word. No books, no carved chronicles, nothing but the haunting, silent geometry of the earth itself. But deep beneath the silt of the river, the twin pillars of black glass, the remains of Kalan and Naya, did not decay. They pulsed. The Final Awakening, A.D. 1800s. The scene shifts. The air is no longer filled with the scent of copal, but with the sharp, acrid smell of coal smoke and the grinding of iron wheels. A young surveyor named Elias stood on the banks of the Mississippi, mapping the territory for the expanding American frontier. He was a man of science, a man of new words. He believed the world was a puzzle to be solved, a map to be filled. While excavating a site for a new bridge, his crew's shovel struck something that didn't sound like stone. It sounded like vibrating crystal. "Careful there," Elias shouted, jumping into the muddy trench. As they cleared the mud, the twin obsidian pillars were revealed. They stood 6 feet tall, fused at the base, looking like two lovers frozen in a dark, glassy embrace. The workers backed away, crossing themselves. The stone felt unnaturally warm. Elias reached out. He was a descendant of the very people who had forgotten this land, his blood carrying the diluted ancient ink of the Sun Clan. The moment his bare hand touched the black glass, the silence finally broke. The dream spoken. The world around Elias didn't vanish, but it blurred. For a split second, the coal smoke was replaced by the smell of roasting maize. The iron bridge was gone, and in its place stood a sprawling city of 10,000 fires, pulsing with color and life. He didn't see a ghost, he saw a memory. He saw a runner with a scarred palm, racing against a shadow that wanted to eat the world. He felt Kalen's fear, Naya's sacrifice, and the weight of the secret they had died to protect. The glass pillars began to glow with a soft golden light. A voice, layered with 1,000 years of dust, whispered into Elias's mind. The dream is not gone. It was only waiting for a tongue that knew to listen. Elias fell to his knees, gasping. The workers rushed to him, but he waved them off. He looked at the obsidian, which was now beginning to crack and crumble into fine black sand. Its job was done. The message had been delivered. The new keeper. Elias returned to his tent that night, but he didn't pick up his surveyor's tools. Instead, he took a quill and a stack of parchment. He realized that the silence was no longer a shield, it was a prison. If the story of the mound builders wasn't told, the shadow would eventually return, feeding on the void where their history should have been. He began to write. He wrote about the great Sun King, the Forbidden Ridge, and the runner who chose to be forgotten so that the world could remember how to breathe. As he wrote the final words, before the dream was spoken, the air in the tent grew still. Outside, the birds stopped chirping for a single respectful second. The silence was finally truly over. The dream had been given a name, and though the empire was dust, its heart was finally beating again in the ink of a new world.
The Great Forgetting was not a single event, but a slow, suffocating blanket that draped itself over the Mississippi Valley for 700 years. The empires of the Sun Clan were not conquered by swords. They were dissolved by the very air they breathed. By the year A.D. 1600, the valley had become a cathedral of shadows. The great plaza of Cahokia, once the heartbeat of a continent, was now a swamp. The massive earthen pyramids were shaggy with briars and ancient oaks. To the tribes that moved into the valley, the Illini, the Osage, the Quapaw, the mounds were not cities. They were the sleeping giants, the bones of a world that existed before the stars were fixed in their places. The Legend of the Runner. Among the campfires of the new tribes, a story began to circulate. It wasn't a history, for history had been erased. It was a ghost story. They spoke of the silent runner, a figure seen only in the moments between dusk and dark. They said he had skin like polished flint and eyes that held the reflection of a city that no longer existed. He didn't speak, he only ran, his feet never touching the grass, his path always leading toward the missing mountain, the forbidden ridge. "He is the one who keeps the shadow asleep," the grandmothers would whisper to the children. "As long as he runs, the silence stays in the ground. If he ever stops, the world will forget its own name again." The intrusion of iron. In the late 1600s, the first pale strangers arrived in birch-bark canoes. They were French explorers, men of crosses and muskets. They looked at the mounds and saw only hills. They looked at the river and saw only a highway for fur. But one man, a Jesuit priest named Father Marquette, felt the heaviness of the land. In his journals, he wrote of a spiritual static that made his compass spin and his dreams turn to ash. "There is a weight here," Marquette wrote by candlelight. "The savages speak of a great silence, a demon of the void. They claim a man of stone guards the gate. I laughed at their super stories, yet tonight I heard the sound of a heartbeat coming from beneath the very earth of this hill. It was a rhythmic thumping, like a runner's pace, steady and eternal." Marquette didn't know he was standing directly over the spot where Kalin had plunged his flint into the Obsidian spire. He didn't know that beneath his boots, the unspoken dream was still fighting to stay buried. The industrial erasure. As the 1800s roared into the valley, the modern world began to speak with a loud, violent tongue. Steam engines screamed, dynamite tore into the hills to make way for railroads. The new men had no room for silence. They saw the mounds as obstacles to progress. In 1869, a construction crew in East St. Louis began to level a massive mound to provide fill dirt for the expanding city. They called it Big Mound. As the steam shovels bit into the ancient earth, they uncovered things that defied explanation. They found skeletons 7 feet tall, draped in copper and pearls. They found chunky stones polished to a mirror finish. And at the very center, at the lowest level of the earth, they found a sealed chamber of black glass. The foreman, a man named Miller, ordered the chamber smashed. "It's just rock," he barked. "Get the sledgehammers." When the first hammer struck the glass, it didn't shatter. It echoed. A sound like 1,000 voices screaming in unison tore through the construction site. Men dropped their tools, clutching their ears as blood trickled from their nostrils. For a few seconds, the modern world vanished. The workers didn't see the city of St. Louis. They saw a bruised purple sky and a towering obsidian spire. They saw Kalin. He was standing in the center of the chamber, his hand still pressed to the wall. He wasn't a corpse. He was a statue of living memory. "Close it up," Miller screamed, his face white with a terror he couldn't name. "Bury it, covered with the river mud, and never speak of this place again." The living ghost. The chamber was buried, hidden beneath the foundations of a factory, but the silence had been nicked. A small leak had formed in the seal Kalin had created. From that day forward, the city of St. Louis became a place of strange disappearances and lost time. People would be walking down a busy street and suddenly forget where they were going. Entire buildings would seem to shimmer in the heat, revealing for a split second the thatched roofs of an ancient empire. The runner was still there. He was just running in the cracks between the seconds. The final guardian. The chapter ends in the present day. A young woman, an archaeologist with Sun Clan ancestry she doesn't yet understand, stands in the shadow of Monk's Mound. She holds a ground-penetrating radar device. The screen flickers. It shows a shape deep beneath the soil. 2 pillars, fused at the base, pulsing with a low-frequency vibration that matches the rhythm of a human heart. She looks at her palm. A faint silver-gray scar begins to itch. "I hear you," she whispers to the wind. The dream is no longer unspoken. It is a hum in the wire. It is a vibration in the concrete, and it is getting louder. The year is 2026. The Mississippi River is swollen, a muddy, violent muscle cheering at its banks. In the shadow of the gateway arch, the ground is vibrating, not with the rumble of traffic, but with a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse that makes the glass in the skyscraper shiver. Maya, the archaeologist with the silver-gray scar on her palm, stands atop Monk's Mound. The modern world below her looks fragile, like a thin sheet of paper laid over a roaring fire. Her radar equipment has stopped displaying data. Instead, the screen is filled with a single repeating symbol, the root. "It's not a haunting," she whispers into her radio. "It's an awakening." The convergence. Across the valley, the forgotten sites begin to react. In the middle of housing developments, in the center of parking lots, and beneath the foundations of old factories, the earth begins to heave.
The holes in the world, the places where the stalkers were defeated, are reopening. The sky over St. Louis turns that sickly, bruised purple of AD 1150. The birds fall silent. The hum of the city dies as the power grids fail, plunged into a darkness that isn't just a lack of light, but a presence of the void. Suddenly, a figure emerges from the mist at the base of the mound. He is translucent, a shimmer of heat and memory. He wears the loincloth of a runner, but his skin is composed of shifting obsidian shards. It is Kalen. Behind him, a step out of sync with time, follows Naya. They are no longer humans, and they are no longer statues. They are the sentinels of the dream. The final message. Maya doesn't run. She feels the scar on her hand burning with a cold silver fire. As Kalen approaches, the modern world begins to peel away. The concrete of the stairs turns back into packed clay. The steel of the distant bridges dissolves into the wooden skeletons of ancient piers. Kalen stops 3 paces from her. He doesn't speak with his mouth. He speaks directly into her blood. The cycle is complete, traveler. The silence has been kept. The name has been hidden. But a world that forgets its roots is a world that has no soil to grow in. You have looked for us in the dirt, but we were always in the breath. He reaches out his hand. Maya hesitates, then presses her palm against his. The Great Remembering. The shockwave doesn't destroy the city, it destroys the forgetting. In an instant, every person in the valley, the commuters happed in their cars, the families in their homes, the elders in the hospitals, experience a flood of 1,000 years of history. They see the festivals of the Sun Clan, they feel the heat of the Grand Plaza, they hear the songs of the river exiles. The silence is shattered, not by a shout, but by a collective memory. The people of the modern world finally see the ground they stand on. They realize they are not the first, and they are not the owners. They are merely the current dreamers. As the golden light fades, Kalen and Naya begin to dissolve. Their long watch is over. They have successfully carried the message across the bridge of a millennium. They turn into fine white sand that the wind carries across the river, returning them to the earth they saved. The new dawn. When the sun rises the next morning, the purple sky is gone. The power returns to the city, but something has changed. The people walking the streets of St. Louis move differently. They look at the mounds with reverence, not curiosity. The unspoken dream is finally spoken, whispered from parent to child, recorded not just in books, but in the very way the people treat the land. Maya stands alone on the summit of the mound. The radar is gone. The scar on her hand has faded into a faint white line, a map of a journey she didn't take but will never forget. She looks out over the river. Beneath the water, she knows the pillars are gone, but the heart of the runner still beats in the rhythm of the waves. The dream was spoken, and for the first time in 10 centuries, the world was finally wide awake.
The year was AD 1200. The great city was no longer a place of stone and soul. It was a white zone, a region of the map where the air shimmered with the static of the great forgetting. Mato, the boy who had survived the cave, was no longer a child. He was a young man with the eyes of a wolf and the hands of a stonemason. Behind him trailed a broken line of 300 survivors, the last of the dream keepers. They were moving south, following the jagged spine of the mountains, but the world was fighting them every inch of the way. The hunger of the horizon. The silence wasn't just staying in Cahokia, it was hunting them. Every night the camp grew smaller, not because people died of disease or hunger, but because they simply ceased to be. Mato would wake up and find a sleeping mat empty. There would be no footprints leading away, no sign of a struggle, just a void where a human being had been. The people who remained couldn't even remember the names of those who were gone. "We are leaking," the old woman Kiva whispered as she stirred a pot of flavorless broth. "Our stories are dripping out of us like water from a cracked jar. If we don't reach the salt water soon, there will be nothing left but the wind." The Valley of the Echoes. On the 14th moon of their journey, they entered a canyon that shouldn't have existed. The walls were made of a strange, translucent quartz that hummed when the wind blew. As the tribe walked through the canyon, the walls began to play back their own memories. Mato saw his mother's face in the rock. He heard the laughter of the Grand Plaza. But the images were distorted, stretched and screaming. "Don't look at the walls," Mato roared, his voice cracking. "Keep your eyes on the ground. If you see yourself in the stone will take you." But for many, the temptation was too great. A young girl, mesmerized by the glowing image of her lost pet, reached out to touch the quartz.
Her hand didn't meet stone. It sank into it like water. Before Mato could reach her, she was pulled inward, her scream becoming a permanent vibration in the canyon wall. The shadow stalkers reborn. The silence had sent a new kind of hunter. These weren't the obsidian giants Kalen had fought. These were the mimics. In the middle of the night, a voice would call out from the darkness. It would sound exactly like a lost father, a missing sister, or a dead king. Mato, come back. The city is rebuilt. The sun is warm again. Mato had to tie the survivors together with braided hemp ropes. He forced them to wear earplugs made of beeswax and resin. They walked in a line of blind, deaf shadows, moving only by the tug of the rope. The stand at the Great Delta. They finally reached the edge of the world, the place where the Mississippi spilled its muddy heart into the infinite blue of the Gulf. Here, the air was different. The salt in the spray acted like a barrier, a natural repellent to the silence that thrived on the still, stagnant air of the inland marshes. But the shadow made one last move. As the sun began to set, the mist behind them congealed into a wall of absolute black. Out of the darkness stepped a figure that stopped Mato's heart. It looked like Kalen. It had his face, his runner's build, and the silver scar on his palm, but its eyes were twin voids of green fire. It held out a hand, offering a piece of black glass. "The journey is over, Mato," the mimic said, its voice a perfect replica of the hero's. "Give me the flint knife. Give me the records. Let the dream rest. You're tired. Let the silence take the weight." Mato looked at the survivors. They were exhausted, skeletal, and half-mad. The temptation to give up, to let the great forgetting wash over them and end their pain, was nearly unbearable. Mato looked at the flint knife in his hand, the last physical object from the time before the silence. He didn't hand it over. Instead, he turned his back on the mimic and walked into the salt water. "The dream doesn't belong to the past," Mato shouted over the roar of the waves. "It belongs to the ones who haven't been born yet." He raised the knife and struck it against a piece of seashell. The spark it created wasn't orange, it was a brilliant, pure white. The salt air got the spark and amplified it. The mimic shrieked, its skin bubbling and peeling away to reveal the hollow void beneath. The silence recoiled, unable to withstand the combination of the salt, the sea, and the spark of human defiance. The first village of the New World. They didn't build pyramids on the coast. They built small, humble huts of driftwood and palm fronds. They didn't crown kings. Mato sat on the beach that night and began the work that would take the rest of his life. He didn't use ink. He didn't use stone. He took a needle made of bone and began to tattoo the history onto the skin of the survivors. Every name, every ritual, every star map was etched into their flesh. "If the world wants to forget us," Mato whispered as he worked, "it will have to peel the skin from our bones." The silence sat at the edge of the tree line, watching, waiting. It couldn't cross the salt, but it didn't leave. It settled in for the long wait, the hundreds of years it would take for the new men to arrive and forget the salt's protection. The descendants of Mato's tribe, now known as the Keepers of the Painted Skin, stood on the white dunes of the Florida coast. Among them was Callie, a young woman whose arms were a tapestry of indigo ink, centuries of history etched into her very pores. She felt the vibration before she saw the ships. It wasn't the rhythmic heartbeat of the runner. It was a jagged, grinding noise that set her teeth on edge. 3 massive wooden towers with white wings crested the horizon. They didn't glide like the canoes of the river exiles. They cut the water like serrated knives. "The dream is shaking," the clan mother whispered, her voice a dry rattle. "The salt is no longer enough. The silence has found a new language to hide in. The coming of the god beasts." When the Spaniards landed, they didn't bring stories. They brought measurement. They brought scales for gold, chains for limbs, and a cross that they used like a sword. De Soto stepped onto the stand, his steel breastplate reflecting the sun so brightly it blinded the keepers. To Callie, he didn't look like a man. He looked like a stalker of the void that had finally found a face. "Where is the yellow stone?" De Soto demanded, through a frightened interpreter. "Where are the cities of gold, the great mounds of the north?" Callie stepped forward, her indigo tattoos pulsing with a faint internal light. She saw the silence clinging to the Spaniards like a gray mist. It was in the way they looked at the trees, not as living spirits, but as lumber. It was in the way they looked at the people, not as dreamers, but as cattle. "The cities are gone," Callie said, her voice steady. "They were folded back into the earth to keep them safe from men like you." The massacre of memory. De Soto did not like riddles. He ordered his cavalry, creatures the keepers called 6-legged demons, to charge. The sand turned red. The silence let out a psychic howl as the iron blade sliced through the tattooed skin of the elders. For the Spaniards, it was a skirmish for gold. For the keepers, it was an erasure. Every person cut down was a library burned.
Every tattooed limb lost to the sand was a century of the unspoken dream vanishing forever. Callie watched in horror as her father was struck down. As his life ebbed away, the indigo ink on his arm began to smoke and dissolve into the air. The silence was feeding on the blood, drinking the history before it could be passed on. "Run, Callie," the clan mother screamed as a harquebus spat fire. "Take the root stone. If they touch it with their iron, the world will never wake up." The flight into the interior. Callie fled into the sawgrass marshes, the heavy breathing of the war horses behind her. She carried a small, heavy object wrapped in bisonhide, the same shard of flint Kalen had used to shatter the obsidian spire 400 years ago. She didn't run toward the safety of the woods. She ran back toward the north, back toward the heels in the world. She realized the Spaniards weren't just explorers. They were a contagion of forgetfulness. Everywhere they walked, they renamed the rivers. They renamed the mountains. They laid their own new names over the old ones like a shroud, suffocating the ancient spirit of the land. The stand at the Blackwater Swamp. Deep in the swamps of what the Spaniards called La Florida, Callie was cornered. The iron-clad men surrounded her, their dogs straining at their leashes, their eyes wild with the gold sickness. "Give us the stone, wench," De Soto's lieutenant roared. "We know it leads to the treasury of the Sun Kings." Callie looked at the men. She saw the silence hovering behind them, a vast faceless shadow that was using these men to finish the job it started in Cahokia. If she gave them the stone, they would use its power to turn the whole continent into a graveyard of memory. She looked at her own tattooed hands. She began to sing, a low, rhythmic chant in the language of the Sun Clan, a language that hadn't been heard by human ears in centuries. The swamp responded. The Spanish horses began to scream and rear back. The water of the marsh turned black as ink. "You want the gold of the sun," Callie cried out, her voice echoing with the strength of 1,000 runners. "Then take the weight of the dream." She didn't throw the stone. She swallowed it. The living relic. The iron men lunged, but as their blades touched Callie, they didn't find flesh, they found granite. Callie's body began to calcify, her skin turning into a dark, iridescent quartz. The indigo tattoos didn't vanish, they became deep, glowing grooves in the rock. She was becoming a new monument, a living seal placed in the heart of the southern swamps to counter the iron tide. The Spaniards fled in terror, convinced they had encountered a witch of the devil. They left her there, a statue of a woman standing in the center of the Blackwater, her eyes frozen in a gaze that looked straight through the centuries. The silence hissed, defeated once again. It had used the Iron Men to kill the people, but it couldn't kill the sovereignty of the stone. Callie stood there as the explorers moved on to find their own deaths in the wilderness. She stood there as the Spanish Empire crumbled. She stood there as the new nation was born around her. She was the bridge, and she was waiting for the girl named Maya to find her in the year 2026. But for now, on the shores of the Gulf, the dream was spoken in the rhythm of the waves, and the runner's heart beat on in the ink of the survivors.
The year was 2024, just 2 years before the Great Awakening. The world was louder than it had ever been. Satellites crisscrossed the sky like silver spiders, weaving a web of data that covered every inch of the planet. People carried the Great Forgetting in their pockets, staring into glowing rectangles that told them what to feel, what to buy, and what to forget. In a high-rise office in Chicago, a systems architect named Leo sat staring at a wall of monitors. He wasn't looking at code, he was looking at a glitch.